Thank you very much for coming here this evening. The North Atlantic Council met tonight to express its solidarity with the United States of America at this moment of great tragedy and mourning. Our deepest sympathy lies with the victims, their families, and all Americans. The NATO nations unanimously condemn these barbaric acts committed against a NATO member state. At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it. On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America. The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all. The facts are clear and compelling. The information presented points conclusively to an al-Qaeda role in the 11th of September attacks. We know that the individuals who carried out these attacks were part of the worldwide terrorist network, al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and his key lieutenants, and protected by the Taliban. On the basis of this briefing, it has now been determined that the attack against the United States of America on the 11th of September was directed from abroad and shall therefore be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
Yes, sir, there's a lot of confusion about Article 5, and to your point, it's only been invoked one time, but I wanted to get your thoughts, or if you could explain, how exactly does that process work? Could NATO countries be pulled into a war without their consent? Does an attack automatically mean that all of NATO is at war? And if Article 5 is invoked, what does that require of the member states?
It's a very, very good question, and it's one that is actually very pertinent to today. So if a country is attacked, then it goes to NATO and it says, we are attacked and we are invoking Article 5. But Article 5 was very carefully constructed. Your fellow countrymen in the United States Senate were very keen to make sure that they were not going to be dragged into some European civil war. And therefore, there are two parts to Article 5. One is that an attack is to be seen as an attack on all. And that's a political declaration which requires consensus. And secondly, the individual countries make a decision as to what they're going to do about it. So it's not automatically getting the integrated military command into place. There are very separate decisions that have to be taken. And in this case, in this particular case, we put it to the Council, so we got the consensus and everybody agreed. Then we waited to see what the United States was going to ask for in terms of Article 5. And it was a couple of weeks later that actually the letter arrived with me on the day I was meeting Vladimir Putin for only the second time. And at the press conference after my meeting with Vladimir Putin, and I think this might be interesting to your younger audience, a man from Le Monde, the French newspaper, asked the question, did you tell President Putin what the Americans have asked for under Article 5? Now, I'd completely forgotten to mention it to him. I thought, I would have done it out of courtesy. I suddenly thought, God, I forgot to tell him. And at that precise point, Vladimir Putin said, no, of course he didn't. Why would he? That's NATO business. So, I told them afterwards, roughly what America had asked for at that time.
I was going to say, in this case, Article 5 was invoked and was able to be passed by all of the member states. What did that mean in terms of NATO support for what would become an operation in Afghanistan?
Well, it was a hugely symbolic decision to be taken and had huge implications in America, big coverage as well. And we sent the NATO AWACS fleet to cover the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics that were going on at the time, which allowed America to send its AWACS, the early warning aircraft, to Afghanistan at that time as well. So it meant that symbolically that we were going to support the Americans and what they needed to do as a consequence of the attack on the Twin Towers and on Washington and the Pentagon as well. And they asked for a whole series of things. They asked for overflight rights. They asked for ports and harbors. They asked for refueling, all of the things that were going to be required in order to take on the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it didn't drag every country into that particular battle, although most of the countries were involved and certainly were on America's side.
This was nearly now a quarter of a century ago, and looking back, do you feel that the Article 5 response was the best one, the appropriate one? You're aware, of course, of all of the think tankers, myself included in my latter years, who have written articles saying, well, maybe the United States should have made more of it at the time. This gesture of support from the Allies that we should have all gone off together to Afghanistan, rather than NATO only going 2 years later. There should have, in a sense, there should have been a more sort of robust response. Is that fair? Or at the end of the day, looking back on it, do you think, for NATO at least, it was the best possible outcome?
I've reflected a lot, and even at that time, that I think that the Americans should have accepted a lot of the offers that were made, because people were instinctively on their side. Remember the headline in Le Monde, "We are all Americans."
Oh yes, indeed.
And so there was a huge degree of sympathy. Even Vladimir Putin was the first one on the phone to President Bush to express sympathy and solidarity. So it was there, and a lot of the allies made offers of troops and equipment in order to help with the campaign against the Taliban at that time. But Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, his deputy, both basically said, look, we're big enough and tough enough, we can do it ourselves. And the allies would have to be actually brought on board. And they had this prejudice against some things by NATO, calling it war by committee.
Yeah.
But I think later on, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs made a personal apology to me and said we should not have turned down the offers. We should have had a collective will, and that might have helped later on with Afghanistan if we'd all been in together. And I think there was a lack of grace, a lack of basically political skill in saying we can do it all on our own and we don't want any other people interfering. They could have accepted the offers, and that would have strengthened the American position.
Yeah, the phrase was that it's the mission that decides the coalition rather than the other way around.